In the marble halls of Chicago's courthouse, justice is supposed to be blind. But sometimes, the truth hides in the shadows where no one thinks to look. Denzel Holloway had everything: a tech empire worth hundreds of millions, respect from his community, and a reputation as one of Chicago's most generous philanthropists. He was living proof that the American dream was still possible for a black man who refused to give up. But today, everything he built is crashing down. In a packed courtroom, cameras flashing and reporters scribbling furiously, Denzel faces 20 years in prison for crimes that could destroy not just his freedom, but his legacy. Money laundering, conspiracy, ties to an international cartel. The evidence seems overwhelming, the prosecution confident, the verdict devastating. As the judge's words echo through the courthouse, Denzel's world shatters. His cries of innocence fall on deaf ears. His protests sound like the desperate pleas of a guilty man caught red-handed. Everyone has already made up their minds about who Denzel Holloway really is. But in this temple of justice, someone has been watching. Someone has been listening. Someone who exists in the spaces between the powerful and the forgotten, who sees what others miss because he's invisible to those who matter. They say the truth will set you free, but first, someone has to be brave enough to speak it. In the next few minutes, everything everyone believes about this case, about guilt and innocence, about power and corruption, about who deserves to be heard, is about to change forever. Because sometimes, the most explosive revelations come from the most unexpected places, and sometimes, justice wears the face of someone no one saw coming. The question isn't whether Denzel Holloway is guilty or innocent. The question is, who will have the courage to reveal what really happened in the shadows of Chicago's courthouse? Subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories that will leave you speechless, and don't forget to like the video if you're ready to discover the shocking truth. Hit the bell notification to witness how one moment can change everything. The Cook County Courthouse had never seen a crowd like this. News vans lined Federal Plaza, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray Chicago sky like mechanical flowers seeking sunlight. Reporters spoke in hushed, urgent tones into their cameras, while protesters held signs reading, "Justice for Denzel" on one side and "Lock him up" on the other. The city was divided, and today would determine which side was right. Inside courtroom 302, every seat was filled. The wealthy elite of Chicago's tech industry sat beside community leaders from the South Side. Lawyers in $1,000 suits shared bench space with teachers and social workers whose programs had been funded by Denzel Holloway's foundation. The air was thick with tension and the smell of too many people packed into too small a space. Denzel Holloway sat at the defendant's table, his usually perfect posture slightly slouched with exhaustion. At 45, he still carried himself like the college basketball star he'd once been, but 3 months of legal battles had taken their toll. His expensive charcoal gray suit couldn't hide the weight he'd lost, and his normally bright eyes were clouded with stress and disbelief. "Mr. Holloway," his lawyer, Sarah Chen, whispered beside him, "whatever happens today, remember that this isn't over. We can appeal. We can." "Sarah," Denzel interrupted softly, "I built my company from nothing. I've donated $60 million to schools and community centers. I've never even gotten a speeding ticket. How did we get here?" Sarah looked at her client with sympathy. She'd been defending white-collar criminals for 15 years, but she'd never worked with someone she believed was truly innocent. Denzel's case was a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit, evidence that seemed too convenient, witnesses whose stories changed just enough to be damaging. "The system isn't perfect," she said, "but the truth has a way of coming out." At the prosecution table, District Attorney Marcus Kane straightened his red tie and reviewed his notes one final time. This case would make his career. Taking down Denzel Holloway, the golden boy of Chicago tech, the success story that politicians love to parade around, would prove that no one was above the law. Not even heroes. Kane was a thin man in his early 50s, with graying hair and the kind of sharp features that looked good on television. He'd built his reputation on high-profile cases, and this was the biggest of his career. The evidence was solid. Bank transfers to offshore accounts, communications with known money launderers, financial records that showed clear patterns of illegal activity. Of course, he'd had help putting it all together. Excellent help. In the third row of the gallery, Richard Lawton sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap. He'd known Denzel since they were 12 years old, growing up in the same neighborhood, playing basketball at the same community center, dreaming the same dreams of escape and success. They'd started Holloway Technologies together in Denzel's garage 15 years ago, building it into a billion-dollar empire through late nights, brilliant innovations, and unwavering friendship. Or so Denzel believed. Richard adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and studied his oldest friend's back. Denzel had no idea that his childhood companion had been systematically destroying his life for the past 2 years. Every forged document, every planted piece of evidence, every coached witness had been Richard's idea, executed with the precision of someone who knew Denzel's business inside and out. It wasn't personal, it was just business. Denzel had become too successful, too visible, too much of a target. Better to cut him loose before he brought down the whole company. Richard would rebuild Holloway Technologies in his own image, without the liability of Denzel's bleeding heart philanthropy and his naive belief that success came without compromises. Judge Patricia Williams entered the courtroom at exactly 2:00 p.m., her black robes flowing behind her like storm clouds. At 62, she was one of the most respected judges in Illinois, known for her fairness and her intolerance of courtroom drama. She'd presided over hundreds of cases in her 25-year career, but never one with stakes this high. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the packed courtroom rose as one. Judge Williams took her seat and surveyed the crowd with stern eyes. "Be seated. We're here today for the sentencing of Denzel Marcus Holloway, who was found guilty on all counts of money laundering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and racketeering. Before I announce the sentence, Mr. Holloway, you have the right to make a statement." Denzel stood slowly, his legs unsteady. He'd practiced this moment in his head 1,000 times, but now that it was here, all his prepared words seemed inadequate. "Your Honor," he began, his voice stronger than he felt, "I stand before you as an innocent man. I've spent my entire adult life building something positive, something that would lift up my community and create opportunities for others. I've never taken a penny that wasn't mine. I've never broken the law. I've never betrayed the trust of the people who believed in me." His voice began to crack. "The evidence against me is false. The witnesses lied. Someone has orchestrated this entire case to destroy me, and I don't understand why. I don't understand how justice can be so blind to the truth." In the gallery, several people were crying. Denzel's mother, a 70-year-old retired teacher, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Marcus Thompson, the courthouse janitor, paused in his quiet sweeping near the back wall to listen. Even some of the reporters seemed moved by the raw pain in Denzel's voice. But Judge Williams remained impassive. She'd heard similar pleas from guilty defendants before. The evidence was overwhelming, the jury's verdict unanimous. Her job was to follow the law, not her emotions. "Mr. Holloway, the jury has spoken, and I must respect their decision. The evidence presented in this case painted a clear picture of deliberate criminal activity spanning multiple years. While I acknowledge your contributions to the community, I cannot ignore the severity of your crimes." Denzel felt the words hit him like physical blows. This was really happening. His life, his company, his reputation, everything was about to disappear. "Therefore," Judge Williams continued, "I sentence you to 20 years in federal prison, with possibility of parole after 12 years. You are also ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $50 million and to forfeit all assets connected to your criminal enterprise." The courtroom erupted. Denzel's supporters cried out in shock and anger, while others nodded in satisfaction. Camera flashes exploded like lightning. Reporters scribbled frantically in their notebooks. But Denzel heard none of it. The words 20 years echoed in his head like a death sentence. His knees buckled, and he gripped the defendant's table to keep from falling. "No," he whispered. Then louder, "No, this is wrong. This is all wrong." "Mr. Holloway," Judge Williams said firmly, "please control yourself." But something had snapped inside Denzel. 20 years of his life, gone. His company, stolen. His reputation, destroyed. And for what? For crimes he'd never committed, evidence he'd never seen, witnesses who were lying through their teeth. "I'm innocent," Denzel shouted, his voice echoing off the courthouse walls. "Someone set me up. Someone destroyed my life." He slammed his fist on the table, sending papers flying. The bailiffs moved toward him, hands on their weapons, but Sarah Chen grabbed his arm. "Denzel, stop. You're making it worse." "Worse?" Denzel laughed bitterly, tears streaming down his face. "How can it get worse? They've already taken everything." Judge Williams banged her gavel repeatedly. "Mr. Holloway, if you don't control yourself, I'll have you removed from this courtroom." But Denzel was beyond control. All the stress, all the humiliation, all the betrayal came pouring out in a flood of emotion that shocked everyone who knew him as a calm, composed businessman. "You want to know the truth?" he cried, turning to face the gallery. "The truth is that somewhere in this city, the real criminals are laughing. They're celebrating while an innocent man goes to prison. They destroyed my life and convinced everyone I deserved it." Security guards moved closer, but Denzel wasn't done. "I built my company with my own hands. I never stole a penny. I helped kids go to college. I fed families. I created jobs. And this is how justice rewards me." "Mr. Holloway, sit down now," Judge Williams commanded. "No, I won't sit down. I won't be quiet. Someone in this room knows the truth. Someone knows who really committed these crimes. And I'll spend every day of the next 20 years proving my innocence." The bailiffs finally reached him, gently but firmly guiding him back to his chair. Denzel collapsed into it, his emotional outburst leaving him drained and shaking. The courtroom gradually quieted, the spectacle of a powerful man's complete breakdown having run its course. Judge Williams watched Denzel with a mixture of pity and frustration. In her experience, guilty defendants rarely showed such genuine anguish. But the evidence was clear, the verdict final. Her personal feelings couldn't override the law. "Mr. Holloway will be remanded to federal custody immediately," she announced. "This court is adjourned." As the gavel fell for the final time, Denzel felt his life officially end. He would appeal, of course, but appeals took years, and the evidence against him seemed unshakable. Whoever had done this to him had been thorough, professional, and absolutely ruthless. The bailiffs approached with handcuffs, and Denzel submitted without resistance. As the metal clicked around his wrists, he looked out at the crowd one last time, searching for a friendly face, for someone who still believed in his innocence. His eyes found Richard Lawton, his oldest friend, his business partner, the one person who should have been fighting hardest to prove his innocence. Richard was looking down at his hands, unable or unwilling to meet Denzel's gaze. "Richard," Denzel called out desperately. "Richard, you know me better than anyone. Tell them I couldn't have done this. Tell them." Richard finally looked up, and for just a moment, Denzel saw something in his friend's eyes that made his blood freeze. Not sympathy, not confusion, not even sadness. Guilt. "I'm sorry, Denzel," Richard said quietly. "I'm so sorry." But Denzel was already being led away, the crowd parting before him like the Red Sea. As he shuffled toward the exit in his shackles, he passed Robert Thompson, the courthouse janitor who'd been quietly cleaning during the proceedings. Their eyes met for just a second, and Denzel saw something unexpected in the older man's face: doubt. Robert had been working at the courthouse for 20 years, and he'd developed an instinct for guilty and innocent. This man, this broken tech mogul being led away in chains, didn't feel guilty. He felt like a victim. Robert's 17-year-old son Jamal was waiting in the hallway, as he did every day after school, doing homework while his father finished his shift. The boy looked up from his textbook as the procession passed, watching with the intense curiosity of someone who'd grown up around the machinery of justice. "Dad," Jamal whispered as Robert emerged from the courtroom, "was that the tech guy? The one who gave all that money to schools?" Robert nodded grimly. "That's him. Or was him, I guess." He seemed really upset. Like, really, really upset. More than the other guilty guys usually are. Robert looked at his son with interest. Jamal had always been observant, always asking questions, always noticing things that adults missed. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. Just, when people get caught doing bad things, they usually seem angry or scared." But he seemed confused, like he really didn't understand what was happening to him. As they walked toward the elevator, neither Robert nor Jamal could have imagined that the boy's observation would soon prove to be the most important insight anyone had offered in the entire case. Because in a building full of lawyers, judges, and law enforcement professionals, a 17-year-old had just identified the one thing that everyone else had missed. Denzel Holloway's confusion wasn't the confusion of a guilty man trying to escape consequences. It was the confusion of an innocent man trying to understand how his entire world had been turned upside down. And somewhere in this building, hidden in the shadows and forgotten corners where important people never looked, was the proof that would change everything. 2 weeks before Denzel Holloway's sentencing, the Cook County Courthouse was a different place at night. The marble halls that buzzed with activity during the day became quiet corridors, filled only with the sound of Robert Thompson's cartwheels echoing off the walls. At 53, Robert had been cleaning these floors for 20 years, and he knew every corner, every office, every secret spot where important people thought no one was watching. "Dad, can I finish my calculus homework in courtroom 302 tonight?" 17-year-old Jamal asked as they entered the building through the employee entrance. "I like the big windows, and the acoustics help me think." Robert smiled at his son. Jamal had been coming to the courthouse after school since he was 12, ever since Robert's wife died, and they couldn't afford after-school care. The boy had practically grown up in these halls, doing homework in empty courtrooms and learning about justice by watching trials during his free periods. "Sure, son. Just remember to turn off the lights when you're done, and stay quiet. Sometimes the lawyers come back late to practice their arguments." Jamal nodded and headed toward the elevator, his backpack full of textbooks and notebooks. He was a senior at Lincoln Park High School, taking college-level courses and dreaming of studying law at Northwestern. His grades were perfect, his SAT scores exceptional, but college was expensive, and Robert's janitor salary barely covered their basic needs. The courthouse had become Jamal's second home and unofficial study hall. He'd watched hundreds of trials from the back rows, learning about evidence and testimony and the way lawyers built their cases. He understood legal procedures better than most first-year law students, even though he'd never taken a formal class. In courtroom 302, Jamal settled into his usual spot in the jury box, spreading his homework across the polished wooden surface. The room was dimly lit by security lighting, creating long shadows that made the space feel both peaceful and mysterious. Through the tall windows, he could see the lights of downtown Chicago twinkling like earthbound stars. As Jamal worked through a complex calculus problem, he heard voices in the hallway. This wasn't unusual. Lawyers often came back after hours to prepare for big cases. But something about these voices made him pause and listen more carefully. "Has to be airtight," a man was saying. "If there's even the smallest hole in our story, his defense team will find it." "Relax, Marcus," came another voice. "Everything is in place. The bank records, the witness statements, the electronic evidence, it all points directly to Holloway." Jamal recognized the first voice as District Attorney Marcus Kane. He'd seen Kane in the building many times, always impeccably dressed and speaking with the confidence of someone who never lost cases. But who was the second man? The voice sounded familiar, but Jamal couldn't place it. "What about Thompson's financial records?" Kane asked. "Are you sure they can't be traced back to us?" "Michael Thompson doesn't exist," the second voice replied with a laugh. "He's a complete fabrication. The accounts were set up using stolen identities and shell companies. Even if Holloway's lawyers find the transactions, they'll just think he was using aliases to hide his money laundering." Jamal's pencil stopped moving across his paper. They were talking about the Holloway case, the biggest trial in Chicago this year. But something was wrong with what he was hearing. They sounded like they were discussing how to frame someone, not how to prosecute a guilty person. "And Chen?" Kane asked, referring to Denzel's defense attorney. "Any chance she'll find the real source of those transfers?" "Sarah Chen is good, but she's not a miracle worker. We made sure the digital trail leads straight to Holloway's personal accounts. She'll never think to look for evidence that her own client was set up." Jamal felt his heart racing. This conversation didn't sound like prosecutors discussing strategy. It sounded like criminals planning a cover-up. "I still can't believe you're willing to destroy your oldest friend," Kane said. "You and Holloway grew up together, didn't you? Business is business, Marcus. Denzel got too big for his own good. All that philanthropy, all that community involvement, it was making him a target. Better to cut him loose before he brings down the whole company." Now Jamal recognized the second voice. Richard Lawton, Denzel's business partner. He'd seen Richard testifying during the trial, expressing his shock and disappointment at his friend's alleged crimes. But now he was talking like he was the one who committed them. "The beauty of it is that Denzel actually believes he's innocent," Richard continued. "He has no idea how we moved the money through his accounts. He genuinely thinks someone else set him up, which makes his protest sound even more desperate and unbelievable." "You're a cold bastard, Lawton," Kane said, but he sounded impressed rather than disgusted. "What's my cut when you take over Holloway Technologies? 20% of the first year's profits, as we discussed, plus that beach house in Malibu you've been wanting. And of course, my full support when you run for State Attorney General next year." Jamal realized he was holding his breath. These two men were talking about destroying an innocent person's life for money and political power, and they were doing it just a few feet away from where he sat, completely unaware that anyone was listening. "The timing worked out perfectly," Richard said. Holloway was so focused on his latest charity project that he never noticed the discrepancies in the financial reports. By the time our anonymous tip led the FBI to investigate, we had 2 years' worth of fake evidence in place. And the jury bought it completely. Kane added with satisfaction. 12 good citizens convinced that another successful black man must be a criminal. Sometimes the system works exactly the way it's supposed to. The casual racism in Kane's comment made Jamal's stomach turn. These men weren't just criminals, they were predators who had used society's prejudices as weapons against an innocent man. I should get going, Richard said. I need to start preparing for the transition. Once Denzel is sentenced and locked away, I'll have to play the reluctant hero, stepping up to save the company from his criminal legacy. Don't forget our agreement about the city contracts, Kane reminded him. My office has a lot of influence over which tech companies get government deals. You'll get your contracts, Marcus. Holloway Technologies will be very generous to our friends in law enforcement. Jamal heard footsteps moving away from the courtroom, but he remained frozen in place, his mind racing. He had just overheard a confession to one of the biggest criminal conspiracies in Chicago history. But who would believe a 17-year-old janitor's son over a district attorney and a successful businessman? His hands trembling, Jamal reached for his phone. He always kept it on silent mode in the courthouse, but the voice recording app was still active from when he'd been studying for his speech class earlier that day. With growing excitement and terror, he realized that his phone had been recording the entire conversation. Everything, every word, every detail of their conspiracy, every piece of evidence needed to prove Denzel Holloway's innocence. But as Jamal stared at the recording on his phone, he felt a crushing weight of responsibility. What was he supposed to do with this information? Who could he trust? And how could he prove that the recording was real and hadn't been faked? He thought about Denzel Holloway's face during the trial, the genuine confusion and pain he'd seen there. Now he understood why the man had seemed so lost. He really was innocent, framed by people he trusted. Jamal carefully packed up his homework, his hands still shaking. His father would be finishing his rounds soon, and they would go home to their small apartment on the south side. But Jamal knew he wouldn't be able to sleep tonight, or probably any night until he figured out how to use this recording to save an innocent man. As he walked through the dark corridors toward the service elevator, Jamal passed several security cameras. He wondered if they had audio recording capability, if there might be other evidence of Richard and Kane's conspiracy hidden in the building's surveillance system. He also wondered how many other conversations he'd overheard during his 5 years of doing homework in these courtrooms. How many times had he been invisible witness to corruption, conspiracy, and injustice? How many innocent people had been destroyed while he sat quietly with his textbooks, unaware that he was hearing confessions to their frame-ups? At the service elevator, Jamal found his father loading his cart with cleaning supplies. Robert took one look at his son's pale face and worried expression. "Jamal, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Dad," Jamal said quietly, "what would you do if you knew something terrible was happening to someone, but you weren't sure anyone would believe you if you tried to help?" Robert studied his son's face carefully. In 20 years of raising Jamal alone, he'd learned to recognize when the boy was carrying a serious burden. "I'd tell the truth," Robert said simply, "even if people didn't want to hear it. Even if it was dangerous or difficult, the truth is the only thing that really matters in the end. But what if the people doing the terrible thing were really powerful? What if they could hurt us for speaking up?" Robert put his hand on his son's shoulder. "Jamal, you know what your mother used to say about courage? She said it's not about not being scared. It's about doing the right thing even when you are scared." Jamal nodded, thinking about his mother's words. She had been a nurse who worked in the emergency room, someone who saw injustice and suffering every day but never stopped fighting to help people. "Son, is this about the Holloway case?" Robert asked perceptively. "You've been watching that trial pretty closely." Jamal looked at his father, this good man who had worked tirelessly to give him opportunities, who had sacrificed everything to make sure his son could go to college and build a better life. Robert deserved to know the truth. "Dad," Jamal whispered, "I think Denzel Holloway is innocent, and I think I can prove it." Robert's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Jamal pulled out his phone and showed his father the recording file. "I accidentally recorded a conversation between the prosecutor and Holloway's business partner. They were talking about how they framed him." Robert stared at the phone in amazement. "Jamal, do you understand what this means? It means an innocent man is going to prison for 20 years unless someone has the courage to speak up. It also means we're about to go up against some of the most powerful people in Chicago. They won't just sit back and let us destroy them. Jamal met his father's eyes. Mom always said we should help people when we can. This might be the most important help I ever give anyone. Robert was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the implications. Then he smiled proudly at his son. Your mother would be proud of you, and I'm proud of you too. But we need to be smart about this. We need to make sure this recording gets to the right people in a way that can't be covered up or ignored. How do we do that? I don't know yet, but we'll figure it out together. As they rode the elevator down to the parking garage, both father and son understood that their lives were about to change dramatically. They were no longer just invisible workers in the courthouse machinery. They were about to become the most important witnesses in the biggest corruption case Chicago had seen in decades. But they also knew that powerful people don't give up their power easily. The next few days would test everything they believed about justice, courage, and the price of doing what's right. In his pocket, Jamal's phone held the key to freeing an innocent man and exposing a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Chicago's legal system. The question was whether a 17-year-old janitor's son would have the courage to use it. The morning of Denzel's sentencing, Jamal Thompson sat on the edge of his bed at 5 a.m., staring at his phone. He'd listened to the recording 50 times in the past 2 weeks, each time hoping he'd misunderstood what he'd heard. But the voices were clear, the conspiracy unmistakable, and the evidence devastating. You ready for this, son? Robert asked from the doorway, already dressed in his courthouse maintenance uniform. Jamal looked up at his father. They'd spent 2 weeks planning this moment, discussing every possible outcome and every risk they were taking. The decision to speak up hadn't been easy, but it was the only choice their consciences would allow. I keep thinking about what could go wrong, Jamal admitted. What if Judge Williams doesn't believe me? What if Kane and Richard claim the recording is fake? What if they come after us? Robert sat down beside his son. I've been thinking about that too, but I've also been thinking about Mr. Holloway sitting in that courtroom yesterday, crying and saying he was innocent. If we stay quiet, that man spends the next 20 years in prison for something he didn't do. And if we speak up, we might end up in danger ourselves. Maybe, but your mother didn't raise us to be cowards. She didn't raise us to let innocent people suffer when we have the power to help them. Jamal nodded, drawing strength from his father's quiet courage. Robert Thompson had never been a man of many words, but when he spoke, his words carried the weight of deep conviction. Dad, what if they don't take me seriously because I'm just a kid? Then we make sure they listen anyway. Truth doesn't care how old you are, Jamal. Truth is truth. They arrived at the courthouse early, before the media circus and the crowds of supporters and protesters. Robert went to his maintenance duties while Jamal found a quiet corner near courtroom 302 to review his plan one more time. He'd made copies of the recording on 3 different devices and uploaded it to a secure cloud account that Kane and Richard couldn't access. He'd also written out a transcript of the conversation, highlighting the most damaging admissions. If anyone tried to silence him or destroy the evidence, copies would still exist. At 9 a.m., the courthouse began filling with people. Jamal watched from his corner as lawyers, reporters, and spectators streamed through the hallways. He recognized many faces from the past 2 weeks of trial coverage. Denzel's mother, community leaders, tech industry executives, and journalists from every major news outlet in Chicago. District Attorney Marcus Kane arrived at 9:30, surrounded by his usual entourage of assistants and prosecutors. He looked confident and relaxed, like a man who had never lost a case and didn't expect to start today. As he passed Jamal's corner, he didn't even notice the 17-year-old sitting with a backpack full of explosive evidence. Richard Lawton entered the building at 9:45, wearing an expensive dark suit and the expression of a grieving friend. He'd played his role perfectly throughout the trial, the loyal business partner shocked by his best friend's betrayal, reluctantly providing evidence that helped convict the man he'd grown up with. Jamal felt a surge of anger watching Richard's performance. This man had destroyed his oldest friend's life for money and power, and now he was pretending to be the victim. At 10 a.m., the crowds began filing into courtroom 302. Jamal took a deep breath and joined the line, his heart pounding as he approached the security checkpoint. The bailiffs knew him as Robert's son, the quiet kid who did homework in the courthouse, and they waved him through without question. Inside the courtroom, Jamal found a seat in the back row, close to where his father would be working during the proceedings. The room was packed beyond capacity, with standing room only in the aisles. Camera crews lined the walls, and sketch artists sat ready to capture every moment of Denzel Holloway's downfall. When Denzel was brought in, shackled and wearing an orange jumpsuit, Jamal felt his resolve strengthen. This was the man whose life hung in the balance, whose innocence Jamal alone could prove. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, but it was also clarifying. Judge Patricia Williams called the court to order, and the sentencing hearing began. Jamal listened as character witnesses spoke on Denzel's behalf. Teachers whose schools he'd funded, community leaders whose programs he'd supported, employees who described him as an ethical and generous boss. But it didn't matter. The jury had already spoken, the evidence had been presented, and the law demanded punishment for the crimes Denzel had been convicted of. Even the most glowing character references couldn't change the facts as the court understood them. Then came the moment Jamal had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Judge Williams asked if Denzel wanted to make a final statement before sentencing. Denzel stood and delivered his passionate plea of innocence, his voice breaking as he proclaimed his confusion and desperation. Jamal watched the judge's face, seeing sympathy but also resignation. She believed the evidence, even if she felt sorry for the man it had condemned. 20 years in federal prison, Judge Williams announced, and the courtroom erupted in chaos. That was when Denzel snapped. His emotional breakdown was painful to watch, a powerful man reduced to tears and rage, pounding the table and screaming his innocence to a room full of people who had already made up their minds about his guilt. As the bailiffs moved to restrain Denzel, as Judge Williams banged her gavel for order, as the media captured every moment of his humiliation, Jamal felt something break inside his chest. This was it. This was the moment he'd been preparing for. He stood up. "Excuse me," he said, his voice barely audible over the commotion. No one heard him. The courtroom was in chaos, with Denzel being led away in handcuffs and spectators crying or cheering depending on their allegiances. "Excuse me," Jamal said louder, raising his hand. A few people in his section turned to look at him, but the noise level was still too high for his voice to carry. Jamal thought about his mother, about her courage in the emergency room when she fought to save patients that other people had given up on. He thought about his father, quietly serving this building for 20 years while watching justice play out in its halls. He thought about Denzel Holloway, walking toward 20 years in prison for crimes he didn't commit. "Your Honor!" Jamal shouted at the top of his lungs. The volume and desperation in his voice cut through the chaos like a knife. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned in his direction. Even Judge Williams looked up from her papers to see who was making such a disturbance. "Your Honor," Jamal repeated, his voice steady now that he had everyone's attention. "I need to be heard. I have evidence that Mr. Holloway is innocent." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Security guards moved toward Jamal, but Judge Williams held up her hand to stop them. "Young man," she said, "this is highly irregular. Court has been adjourned, and—" "Please," Jamal interrupted, something he never would have done under normal circumstances. "I know this is unusual, but I have a recording that proves Mr. Holloway was framed. I accidentally recorded a conversation between District Attorney Kane and Richard Lawton where they admitted to setting him up." The murmur became a roar. Kane shot to his feet, his face flushing red. "Your Honor, this is preposterous. This boy is obviously—" "Let him speak," said a voice from the gallery. Denzel's defense attorney, Sarah Chen, was on her feet now too. "Your Honor, if there's even a possibility that new evidence exists, we have an obligation to hear it." Judge Williams looked around the chaotic courtroom, then at Jamal, who stood trembling but determined in the back row. In her 25 years on the bench, she'd never faced a situation quite like this. "Young man, what's your name?" "Jamal Thompson, Your Honor. My father is Robert Thompson. He's the janitor here. I do my homework in the courthouse after school, and 2 weeks ago I accidentally recorded a conversation in this very courtroom." "This is ridiculous," Kane interjected. "Your Honor, you can't seriously consider listening to accusations from a child with no legal standing." "Mr. Kane," Judge Williams said sharply, "you'll have your chance to respond. Son, you said you have a recording." Jamal nodded and held up his phone. "Yes, ma'am. It's all here. They talked about forging bank records, creating fake witnesses, and using shell companies to make it look like Mr. Holloway was laundering money. Mr. Lawton said he did it to take over the company, and Mr. Kane said he did it for money and political support." The courtroom was dead silent now. Every reporter was recording. Every spectator was holding their breath. Every lawyer was calculating the implications of what they were hearing. Richard Lawton had gone pale as a sheet. "This is insane," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Your Honor, surely you're not going to—" "Mr. Lawton," Judge Williams interrupted. "I suggest you remain quiet until you've heard what this young man has to say." She turned back to Jamal. "Son, I need you to understand something. Making false accusations against a prosecutor and a witness in a federal case is a very serious crime. Are you absolutely certain about what you're telling me?" Jamal looked around the courtroom, seeing all the powerful people whose lives he was about to turn upside down. He saw Kane's furious face, Richard's panicked expression, and the dozens of cameras pointed in his direction. He thought about how much easier it would be to sit down, apologize for the disruption, and let an innocent man go to prison. Then he looked at Denzel Holloway, who was staring at him with desperate hope, and he found his courage. "Yes, ma'am, I'm absolutely certain, and I have the recording to prove it." Judge Williams was quiet for a long moment, weighing her options. This was unprecedented. A sentencing hearing interrupted by a teenager claiming to have evidence of prosecutorial misconduct and conspiracy. Every legal precedent told her to dismiss the boy and proceed with the sentencing. But something in Jamal's eyes, something in his voice, something in the way Kane and Richard were reacting, told her that this wasn't a prank or a desperate lie. "Very well," she said finally. "Mr. Thompson, approach the bench. Bailiff, please escort Mr. Holloway back to the defendant's table. It appears we have some additional evidence to consider." As Jamal walked down the aisle toward the judge's bench, his legs shaking with each step, he felt the weight of every eye in the courtroom. He was about to play a recording that would destroy careers, expose corruption, and potentially save an innocent man's life. Behind him, he could hear Kane whispering urgently to his assistants and Richard Lawton making phone calls. They knew what was coming, and they were already trying to figure out how to contain the damage. But it was too late for damage control. The truth was about to come out, and Jamal Thompson, 17 years old, son of a janitor, invisible to everyone who mattered, was about to become the most important witness in Chicago legal history. The only question now was whether the system he was challenging would have the courage to listen to what he had to say. The walk to Judge Williams' bench felt like the longest journey of Jamal's life. Every step echoed in the silent courtroom, where hundreds of people waited to hear evidence that could overturn one of the biggest convictions in Chicago history. His hands trembled as he held his phone, but his voice was steady when he reached the front of the room. "Your Honor," Jamal began, "2 weeks ago, I was doing homework in this courtroom after hours. I always keep my voice recording app running when I study because it helps me review my notes later. I had no idea anyone else was in the building except my father." Judge Williams leaned forward, her experienced eyes studying the young man before her. "Continue." "I heard voices in the hallway, and then 2 men came into this courtroom. They didn't know I was here. I was sitting in the jury box, and the lights were dimmed. They talked for about 15 minutes, and my phone recorded everything." District Attorney Kane stood up abruptly. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We have no way to verify the authenticity of any alleged recording. This boy could have fabricated." "Mr. Kane," Judge Williams said firmly, "you'll have your opportunity to challenge the evidence. For now, I want to hear what Mr. Thompson has to say." She turned back to Jamal. "Son, before we proceed, I need to warn you again. If this recording is fake, or if you're lying about how you obtained it, you could face serious criminal charges." Jamal nodded. "I understand, Your Honor. I've thought about that every day for 2 weeks, but I keep thinking about Mr. Holloway's face when he said he was innocent. I believe him." Sarah Chen, Denzel's defense attorney, approached the bench. "Your Honor, I request that we hear this recording immediately. If there's any possibility that my client has been wrongfully convicted, we have a moral and legal obligation to investigate." Richard Lawton was on his feet now too, his usual calm demeanor cracking. "This is a circus, Your Honor. You're going to let the word of a janitor's son overturn a jury verdict? This is exactly the kind of desperate stunt." "Mr. Lawton," Judge Williams interrupted, "your concern is noted, but justice requires that we examine all evidence, regardless of its source." She looked at Jamal. "Young man, how do we know this recording hasn't been altered or manipulated?" Jamal reached into his backpack and pulled out a folder. "Your Honor, I made copies on 3 different devices, and I uploaded the original to a cloud storage account with timestamp verification. I also wrote out a transcript of everything they said, and I can point out where each voice says specific things." Judge Williams was impressed despite herself. This teenager had handled evidence with more care than some experienced attorneys. "Very well, bailiff, please set up the courtroom audio system. We're going to listen to this recording." As the bailiff prepared the equipment, Jamal looked back at the gallery and saw his father standing near the back wall. Robert gave him an encouraging nod, and Jamal felt a surge of strength. Whatever happened next, he knew he was doing the right thing. Before we begin, Judge Williams announced to the packed courtroom, "I want absolute silence. Any disruptions will result in immediate removal from this courtroom." Kane was frantically whispering to his assistant prosecutors, while Richard was on his phone, presumably calling his lawyers. But it was too late for damage control. The truth was about to be revealed. Jamal connected his phone to the audio system and found the recording file. "Your Honor, this conversation took place at approximately 9:15 p.m. on October 15th, 2 weeks ago. I can identify both voices, District Attorney Kane and Mr. Richard Lawton." "Proceed," Judge Williams said. The recording began to play, and Kane's voice filled the courtroom. "Has to be airtight. If there's even the smallest hole in our story, his defense team will find it." Then Richard's voice, "Relax, Marcus. Everything is in place. The bank records, the witness statements, the electronic evidence. It all points directly to Holloway." A collective gasp rose from the gallery. Several jurors from Denzel's trial were in attendance, and their faces showed shock and growing horror as they realized what they were hearing. Kane's voice continued, "What about Thompson's financial records? Are you sure they can't be traced back to us?" Richard's laugh was chilling. "Michael Thompson doesn't exist. He's a complete fabrication. The accounts were set up using stolen identities and shell companies. Even if Holloway's lawyers find the transactions, they'll just think he was using aliases to hide his money laundering." Denzel, who had been sitting in stunned silence, suddenly understood the full scope of the conspiracy against him. Tears streamed down his face, but now they were tears of relief mixed with rage. The recording continued with devastating clarity. Richard's admission that he had framed his oldest friend for profit. Kane's casual discussion of their corrupt bargain. The racist comment about the jury being predisposed to convict a successful black man, when Richard's voice said, "The beauty of it is that Denzel actually believes he's innocent. He has no idea how we moved the money through his accounts. He genuinely thinks someone else set him up, which makes his protests sound even more desperate and unbelievable." Several people in the gallery began crying. Judge Williams' face was stone-cold fury. In 25 years on the bench, she had never witnessed such a complete perversion of justice. The men she had trusted to uphold the law had made a mockery of everything she believed in. When the recording ended, the courtroom remained silent for several long seconds. Then chaos erupted. "Arrest Kane," someone shouted from the gallery. "Free Denzel," cried another voice. Reporters were frantically typing on their phones and laptops, breaking the story in real time. Camera crews zoomed in on Kane's pale face and Richard's panicked expression. Judge Williams banged her gavel repeatedly. "Order! Order in this court!" Kane stood up, his voice shaking. "Your Honor, this recording is obviously fabricated. The defense has had weeks to create fake evidence, and now they're using this boy to—" "Mr. Kane," Judge Williams said, her voice deadly quiet, "are you seriously claiming that this 17-year-old somehow fabricated a conversation using voice synthesis technology advanced enough to fool audio experts?" Your Honor, I demand a full investigation of this alleged evidence before. The only investigation that's going to happen, Mr. Kane, is into your own conduct." Judge Williams turned to the bailiffs. "Place District Attorney Kane under arrest immediately." The bailiffs moved toward Kane, who backed away in disbelief. "This is insane. You can't arrest a sitting district attorney based on the word of a child." "I'm not arresting you based on his word," Judge Williams replied. "I'm arresting you based on your own words, recorded for posterity, confessing to conspiracy, fraud, and perversion of justice." As the handcuffs clicked around Kane's wrists, Richard Lawton bolted for the exit. But court security was ready for him, and he was tackled before he reached the door. "Let me go," Richard screamed as he was dragged back to the front of the courtroom. "You have no right to arrest me. I'm a victim here too." Judge Williams looked at him with disgust. "Mr. Lawton, you have just been exposed as the architect of one of the most elaborate frame-ups in this court's history. You destroyed your oldest friend's life for money and power. You are many things, but you are certainly not a victim." As Richard was handcuffed and led away, he caught sight of Jamal standing near the judge's bench. "You little bastard," he snarled. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you know how many people you've hurt?" Jamal looked directly at Richard, his young face showing a wisdom beyond his years. "I know exactly what I've done, Mr. Lawton. I've told the truth." With both conspirators under arrest, Judge Williams turned her attention to Denzel. "Mr. Holloway, please approach the bench." Denzel stood on shaking legs, barely able to believe what was happening. Just minutes ago, he had been facing 20 years in prison. Now, the men who had destroyed his life were in handcuffs. "Mr. Holloway," Judge Williams said, "based on the evidence we've just heard, I am immediately overturning your conviction and ordering your release. All charges against you are hereby dismissed." The courtroom exploded in cheers. Denzel's mother sobbed with joy. Community leaders who had supported him throughout the trial stood and applauded. Even some of the reporters were wiping away tears. Denzel turned to Jamal, this 17-year-old who had saved his life. "Son, I don't know how to thank you. You gave me back my freedom, my reputation, my future." "You don't need to thank me, Mr. Holloway," Jamal replied. "You deserve the truth." Judge Williams called for order one final time. "Before we adjourn, I want to address something important. Mr. Thompson, what you did today required extraordinary courage. You risked your safety, your family's security, and your future to speak up for someone you didn't even know. That is the very essence of justice and citizenship." She paused, looking out at the packed courtroom. "This case should serve as a reminder to all of us, prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, and citizens, that justice is only as strong as our commitment to truth. When we allow corruption to flourish, when we let prejudice influence our decisions, when we stay silent in the face of injustice, we all bear responsibility for the consequences." As the court was adjourned and the handcuffed Kane and Richard were led away, Jamal was surrounded by reporters asking for interviews, but he only wanted to find his father. Robert pushed through the crowd and wrapped his son in a fierce hug. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered. "Your mother would be so proud." "Dad, what happens now?" Jamal asked, suddenly feeling exhausted from the emotional intensity of the morning. "Now, son, you go back to being a 17-year-old kid who's got college applications to finish. But you'll always know that when it mattered most, when an innocent man needed someone to speak up for him, you found the courage to do the right thing." 3 months later, Kane was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for corruption and conspiracy. Richard received 20 years for fraud, racketeering, and destruction of justice. The stolen $50 million was recovered and returned to Holloway Technologies. Denzel's company not only survived the scandal but thrived under his renewed leadership. He established the Jamal Thompson Foundation for Justice, providing scholarships for young people who wanted to study law and work in public service. Jamal received full scholarships to multiple universities and chose Northwestern, where he planned to study law. His first day of college orientation, he received a text from Denzel: "The world needs more people like you. Thank you for reminding us all that heroes come in every age, from every background, and sometimes they're exactly where we least expect to find them." Robert was promoted to head of courthouse maintenance, with a staff of his own and the respect of everyone who worked in the building. Judges, lawyers, and court personnel who had barely noticed him before now stopped to shake his hand and ask about his remarkable son. On the anniversary of Denzel's exoneration, Judge Williams invited Jamal back to courtroom 302 for a special ceremony. As he stood at the podium where he had once done homework, now addressing a room full of law students and legal professionals, Jamal reflected on how much had changed. "A year ago, I was just a kid doing calculus problems in this room," he told the audience. "I never thought my voice mattered. I never thought anyone would listen to someone like me. But I learned that in our justice system, every voice matters, every witness matters. Every person who has the courage to speak truth to power matters." He paused, looking out at the faces in the audience. Future lawyers, judges, and public servants who would shape the next generation of American justice. "The most important lesson I learned is that being invisible isn't the same as being powerless. Sometimes the people who see the most clearly are the ones everyone else overlooks. And sometimes the most important truth comes from the most unexpected place." After the ceremony, as Jamal walked through the courthouse hallways where his father still worked, where he had grown up learning about justice and law, he passed by the jury box where he had sat that night, 2 weeks before Denzel's sentencing. He thought about the teenager he had been then, scared, uncertain, carrying a terrible burden of knowledge. And he thought about the man he was becoming, confident, purposeful, committed to using his voice to protect the innocent and expose corruption wherever he found it. The courthouse would always be special to him, not just because his father worked there, but because it was where he had learned that courage isn't about being fearless. Courage is about being afraid and speaking up anyway. Courage is about knowing that your voice matters, even when powerful people want you to stay quiet. As Jamal left the building and walked into the Chicago sunlight, he carried with him the knowledge that he had changed not just one man's life, but the entire system's understanding of where truth and justice could be found. Sometimes the most important voices belong to the people no one expects to hear from, and sometimes a 17-year-old with a cell phone recording can save an innocent man and remind everyone that in America, justice is supposed to be for everyone. The end? A story about finding your voice when it matters most, about the courage to challenge corruption even when you're young and powerless, and about how sometimes the most important truth comes from the most unexpected witness. Because in the pursuit of justice, every voice matters, especially the ones that powerful people don't want to hear.